you enjoy my content, please give a like and a sub. They say it helps with the YouTube algorithm, but it definitely makes me feel loved. Welcome back, everyone. So I just have to get this out of the way. Warning for those who haven't seen the newest Spider-Man movie. There will be spoilers. Also, an FYI, pretty much all the rumors that there were are true. If you get a chance, check out my video on the matter that I did a few months ago, if you want to. Now that this movie is open, the Spider-Man audience has been rumbling about a possible Amazing Spider-Man 3, starring the middle child of the Spider-Man franchise, Andrew Garfield. A Twitter campaign is starting to emerge, and Andrew Garfield is enjoying a renaissance period, as is the Amazing Spider-Man franchise, I would say at least. Could a Amazing Spider-Man 3 be the new Release the Snyder Cut? Let's see if this campaign has a chance of success. To say the Spider-Man in the movie format is a nasty and complicated affair is very much an understatement. Now, truth be told, I have no idea if you, the audience members, enjoy me taking a look back on the events that lead up to a situation like I'm going to go through all of Spider-Man history, at least on the big screen, to get to a possible Amazing Spider-Man 3. And judging by the low viewership my most recent videos have been getting, you probably don't. But this is my channel, and to quote the legendary Eric Cartman, I do what I want. In the 90s and early 2000s, Marvel, and I mean Marvel Comics, there was no Marvel Studios at this point, was pretty much on the verge of bankruptcy and had sold off the film and merchandising rights to some of the most popular of characters that they had. The X-Men was sold to Fox, and we got the first run of the X-Men movies beginning in the year 2000. Sony bought the film rights to Spider-Man from Marvel. The weird thing about the contract is Sony has the film rights to Spider-Man in perpetuity, as long as they make a Spider-Man movie every 5.75 years. So why would Marvel do this? Again, there was no MCU. Kevin Feige was pretty much getting his feet wet both on the X-Men pictures and Spider-Man movies, ironically. Just a quick aside, but I mentioned before Marvel was on the verge of bankruptcy after the comic boom of the early 90s. This deal did help the company exist as a comic book publisher. Also, at this point in time, the company had no plans of entering the film world with their own studio. So as long as Sony keeps using Spider-Man, they pretty much keep the character forever. In 2002, we got the much beloved Spider-Man movie directed by the legendary Sam Raimi, and it starred Tobey Maguire. This movie was huge, grossing $821.7 million worldwide, and got a fantastic critical response with a 90% on Rotten Tomato. So to keep that in perspective, money-wise, $1.3 billion is the equivalent of what this movie made back in 2002. 2 years later, Spider-Man 2 came out with a $788 million box office and a 93% on the tomato meter. Up until the most recent MCU films, and probably The Dark Knight, I would throw that in there too, Spider-Man 2 was regarded as the best comic book superhero movie. I'll say it still holds up even against many of today's comic book movies. Now in 2007, we ended up getting Spider-Man 3. And let's just say it wasn't as great as the first two. Mind you, I am being extremely diplomatic when I say this. But I will say there are some great memes that originated from that movie. Also, the Bully Maguire videos. I will always be thankful to Spider-Man 3 for Bully Maguire. From word one, the production was plagued. They had too many villains, a weak subplot involving amnesia, an attempted love triangle that really nobody cared about, and a really bad introduction to a beloved character in Venom. The movie was a hot mess and almost killed Sam Raimi's love for movie making. In fact, he backed off from filmmaking for 6 years, and Sony reconsidered any plans of continuing the saga with Sam, Tobey, and the rest of the game. This is a shame since a Spider-Man 4 was a possibility at that point. The movie did do surprisingly well with $895 million worldwide box office numbers, but it was panned by critics and longtime Spider-Man and Venom fans alike. I'm not sure if they were trying to introduce too much at once or just had a rushed production schedule, but you could tell it was not the caliber of the previous 2 installments. About 5 years later, in 2012, Mark Webb directed the Amazing Spider-Man film. It also starred Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone. Critically, it did better than Spider-Man 3, that's not too hard though, but nowhere near Spider-Man 1 and 2. It did good at the box office though, $758 million worldwide. And for the movie itself, some say that Andrew's Spider-Man was superior to Tobey's. Also, The Amazing Spider-Man guaranteed Sony's ownership of the character since the 5.75 year mark had been coming. Personally, I thought it was good. I enjoyed it, but Spider-Man at times came off a little bit douchey rather than funny, and the big difference was his version of Peter Parker. Andrew's Peter Parker was a cool nerd instead of an awkward one. I thought this kind of went against the comic version of the character, making Peter an example of geek chic. But the film did have some lovely moments, like the city coming together to rescue the web slinger, and the romance between Peter Parker and Stacy. Also, I liked Stacy quite a bit, Gwen Stacy. She was a hero in her own right. This movie was released the same year as the MCU film The Avengers. The MCU's Avengers showed the rest of the film industry the benefits of a shared universe film franchise. And I'm pretty sure Sony saw big dollar signs because they fast-tracked a sequel. In 2014, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was released, and oh boy, it was a bit of a doozy. Granted, it did okay numbers at the box office, but it was a bit of a disappointment to the critics and the audience. Again, like Spider-Man 3 7 years previous, this movie tried to do too much with one film. The movie effectively introduced 3 villains in an attempt to set up a Sinister Six movie. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 had been intended to launch the Sony Cinematic Spider-Verse. If it had worked, it could have given Sony their own shared universe. Ironically, Sony Pictures would eventually achieve this shared universe, kinda, with the assist of the MCU. Now, with the disappointment of The Amazing Spider-Man 2 and seeing that many studios were struggling to set up a shared universe, Sony and Disney reached a unique agreement to have Spider-Man enter the MCU. This would be a new Spider-Man with a different actor. Basically, Marvel was free to use Spider-Man in their films, and Sony would make the solo Spider-Man films with some involvement of Marvel. This move was pretty risky on both studios, but it has more than paid dividends for both parties. Spider-Man's first entry into the MCU was a pretty darn strong showing in Civil War. Peter Parker, played by the very talented actor Tom Holland. The character Peter had been recruited by Tony Stark and held his own in fights with the Falcon, Winter Soldier, and of course Captain America. He even earned Cap's respect in the process. It really was awesome to see Spider-Man interacting with the rest of the MCU. This was followed by the first of the solo Spider-Man films, Spider-Man Homecoming. Again, this was a very strong entry as a Spider-Man movie, and their choice of casting the villain, the Vulture, with Michael Keaton was freaking amazing. Homecoming, in my opinion, was definitely better than the Amazing Spider-Man franchise, and probably equal to the first 2 of the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man. But one complaint about the MCU Spider-Man was they had reduced Peter Parker into a Tony Stark Jr. type of guy. This argument does have some valid points, but I don't blame the studio for going in that direction. The chemistry between Robert Downey Jr. and Tom Holland was gold. Why wouldn't you want to take advantage of it? Also, it did fit with Tony Stark's character growth, with him looking to Peter as a son figure. But some of the hardcore Spidey fans didn't care for this part of the MCU Spider-Man. Homecoming was followed up with Spider-Man Far From Home. This also marked the end of the Phase 3 of the MCU. Far From Home was a wonderful film showing the aftermath of the events of both Infinity War and Endgame. You know, the snap and the return. Humanity had been through a collective trauma, with the newly coined term blipping of half the population. 5 years later, the blipped population returned all of a sudden, including Peter Parker. Even with the return of people's loved ones, there was cost. For some, the biggest cost was the loss of Natasha Romanoff. For Peter specifically, it was the loss of Tony Stark. Far From Home was about Peter's response to the loss of his father figure. Granted, the story was really with Mysterio, Nick Fury, and the budding romance with MJ, but it was the way Peter learned to emerge from Tony's shadow that was probably the strongest part of the movie. This film also kind of hinted at the idea of a multiverse. Kinda. I know Doctor Strange did it first. Now in 2021, 2025 in the MCU timeline, the multiverse has become the primary focus of the latest Spider-Man movie, No Way Home. Of course, spoilers. There are 3 Spider-Men, and virtually all the villains from their respective cinematic universes. Reportedly, both Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire received $1 million paycheck for their roles in the film. But something else might have come from this movie that Sony hadn't anticipated: a renewed relationship with the Amazing Spider-Man actor, Andrew Garfield. This could be advantageous for Sony. With their deal with the MCU, they have been able to effectively grow their own Spider-Verse with Venom and the Into the Spider-Verse movies. They also have a Mobius set for release and possibly a Kraven the Hunter movie. Originally, the plan was to have their Spider-Verse be kind of adjacent to the Tom Holland Spider-Man movies, at least with the original deal that Sony and Disney had. Recently, a new deal was worked out between the two studios that will keep Holland Spider-Man in the MCU along with the solo movies. Now, if they wanted to, Sony could have a legitimate way of moving forward with their shared universe without any assistance of the MCU, and that is revisiting a plan they had all the way back in 2012. Of course, I'm talking about Andrew Garfield's Amazing Spider-Man movies. Granted, Sony can still go forward with Tom Holland, especially with the ending of the last movie, but they always have to contend with Disney, and I'm sure there's red tape involved to utilize their character. With the Amazing Spider-Man, they are free to do whatever they wish with them. Have them face off against Venom, Mobius, or Kraven. They could throw the Amazing Spider-Man in the animated Spider-Verse. They could do a live-action Spider-Man 2099 team-up film with them. Really, there are a lot of options for Sony. Another positive is goodwill with the hardcore Spider-Man base. Hashtags about TASM3 have been popping up all around Twitter. At the moment, TASM3 doesn't have the uniformity of a Release the Snyder Cut, but that had Zack Snyder leading the charge. One thing is certain, Andrew Garfield is a really good Spider-Man, and at least deserves to finish the trilogy. Also, we know for a fact he is game to return as the Whip Slinger. And as wonderful as it was to see Tobey, I don't see him returning to star in any more Spider-Man films. Andrew Garfield, on the other hand, he could return for a third Amazing Spider-Man movie, and possibly even more if Sony wants to make more. and I think it'd be really cool. But, of course, that's just my opinion, and I would love to hear yours. Feel free to comment with your thoughts, and if you haven't already, I'd love a like and a subscribe, but only if you enjoy my content. Fare thee well, my friends, and take care. Cue the music.